My name is Jordan Greenbaum. I'm a child abuse physician from Atlanta. I work at the Children's Healthcare of Atlanta and also work at the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And a lot of my work in the last 10 years or so has been on child sexual exploitation and trafficking. That's really my real passion is. And so today I'm with your permission, going to talk a little bit about trafficking and an intersection with healthcare because there is an awful lot of overlap. We see a lot of trafficked children and adults. So I'm hoping that at the end of this very brief talk that you'll be familiar with the definition, the federal definition of trafficking, and the risk factors that make some children, some adults more vulnerable than others, and possible indicators of trafficking that may be presented. Thank you.
The right-hand side. Yep.
May present in healthcare settings, what we might, little tips and key indicators that might suggest something's going on. And then we'll talk a little bit about how you might respond if you do have a concern about trafficking. So those are the objectives. If you look at the federal law, it's complicated like any other law, but you can break it down into three components. To say that somebody has been trafficked, you have to show an action, a means, and a purpose. And it's like an a la carte menu. You don't have to show all of these things. You just need to show one from each column. So you have to demonstrate one of these things has happened using force or fraud or coercion. Coercion can be very subtle, like taking somebody's visa or their passport so they're no longer having identification, or it can be more overt threats to you, threats to your family. For the purpose of one of these things, it breaks down into two types of exploitation: labor exploitation and commercial sexual exploitation. So you have to have an action, a means for either sex or labor exploitation. There's a really important caveat to this law. If you're dealing with a minor, anyone under 18, and you're talking about sex trafficking, you don't have to show force, fraud, or coercion. It's almost always there, but you do not need to demonstrate that. And the reason why that's so important is because this opens up the definition to include many more vulnerable kids. If you think about all the kids who run away, are homeless, they're out on the streets, thousands of them around the country. Many of them, anywhere from 15 to 45% of them, will at some point engage in commercial sex because they need survival sex, we call it. Get a blowjob in order to get someplace to stay for the night. And so they're, by definition, being sex trafficked if they're under 18, even though they would be the first ones to say, nobody's forcing me to, I don't have a pimp, I've decided to do this. They can't legally consent. Now, for forced labor for children, you do have to show forced fraud or coercion because children can have jobs. So you have to, so that does become an issue for labor trafficking. You're probably going to hear a lot of numbers. You have heard a lot of numbers about how big the problem is in the United States and around the world, but I would just caution you to be very careful about interpreting them. They're all estimates, and it's very difficult to figure out a really reliable estimate of prevalence because it's a criminal activity, so people are not reporting it. For any number of reasons, trafficked persons are not telling us they're trafficked, so they're not volunteering that, and it's very, very hard to identify. So any numbers that you see, keep that in mind, that they're probably very, they're gross estimates. But what we do know is there are a lot of different varieties of experiences that can lead to trafficking. Trafficking is much more than sort of the stereotype that you might be familiar with. If any of you saw Taken, or did you see that movie Taken? A lot of people have. So they get in this mind that the victim is always a girl or a woman, and the trafficker is always a man, and they're part of a criminal network, and it's a international type of thing. And you get that in your mind, and you think that's what it is, but it's actually much bigger than that. Boys are victims. Many of the homeless youth who are engaging in survival sex are boys. Transgender youth are especially high risk. Not all traffickers are men. Many women are traffickers. About a third of those who are prosecuted for trafficking are women. So we can't assume that they're always sort of the stereotype. And labor trafficking is much more than what you think of sort of the migrant farm worker. That's what I always think about labor trafficking. It's got to be somebody from Mexico being labor trafficked in farming. And that is a huge problem. It is a big labor sector for trafficking, but it's not the only one. Think about construction, landscaping, hospitality industries, who think about who's cleaning your hotel room, the last place you stayed, or who did the dishes in the last restaurant you went to, who's taking care of your mother or your grandmother at a retirement community, sort of health facility, nail salons, massage parlors, it's everywhere. Construction is a big one as well. So we have to think really broadly. So let's take a couple of examples. Hector is a 16-year-old male from a very small, rural, very poor village near Villanueva in Guatemala. And you're probably familiar with the situation in Guatemala. Lots of violence, gang violence, community violence. People want to get their kids out of there. And Hector wants to make some money for his very poor family. So he answers an ad that an employment agency has put in the newspaper advertising for a job in Dallas in construction. Now, Hector is not even about Dallas, he's not even about the United States. And this person says, you can just pay us $5,000 US and we'll get you your job, your passport, your visa, and apartment, we'll get you squared away. $5,000, he doesn't have $5,000. That's okay, Hector, because we're gonna loan that to you. And you'll make it all back in 2 weeks because you know when you'll be part of a union, you'll make bundles of money. You'll pay it back. Of course, that's not what happens. He works 16 hours a day. They take his passport and they say, now you owe $20,000. There are a few extra items that we left out. Now you owe $20,000 and we won't give you your passport or any money until you pay it back. He's stuck. Pat, 20-year-old transgender youth, male, female, has run away from home since when she was 17. She gets out on the street. She does what everybody else is doing when they don't have any money or resources. She sells sex to get what she needs. At 17, is she a victim of sex trafficking? Yeah, she's less than 18. She doesn't have a pimp. She's doing it herself, but she's under 18. On her 18th birthday, midnight, something happens and she becomes an adult. She goes out and does the same thing. Now is she a victim of trafficking? No, not until somebody forces her or coerces her to do it. Then she becomes a victim. And then finally, Keisha is kind of the all-American 13-year-old kid doing well in school, two parents at home, they're both working, very solid family relationship, no real risk factors except she's 13. Think about what you were doing when you were 13, not making the best decisions. So maybe she gets in a fight with her mother, she stomps out the house, she's walking down the street, cursing the world, and these two guys drive up in a car. I'm not going to say a pink Cadillac, that's too much, but they drive up in a car, and they're in their 20s, and they're in a car, and they say, you know, whoa, who are you? And, you know, she's 13, my name's Keisha. Okay, you don't look like you're very happy, you look like you're pretty upset. Well, I am upset. Well, tell us about it. And the car will drive around, get you something to eat. They drive around, they give her a lot of attention, they tell her how much they feel sorry for her and her terrible mother, it's really terrible. But they don't take her home, they take her to an abandoned house. She gets a little worried at this point, she's not going home. But there's a woman there, so she says, well, I can trust this, the woman there. She looks like a nice young person. She goes in the house, they get off the drugs and alcohol. She doesn't do drugs, alcohol. It doesn't take much to get her real high. And after a few hours, one of those men has convinced her that he wants to be her boyfriend and have sex with her. They keep her high for a few days, start bringing in the men to have sex with her. She's a victim of sex trafficking. So all sorts of experiences can lead you down to the same sort of exploitation. So who's at risk? Really, anyone could be at risk, but most people have vulnerability factors. Keisha had very few other than her young age, which is a significant factor. But most people will have risk factors at the individual level. LGBTQ status is that's a very big risk factor. Some of the biggest ones we see are homelessness, runaway status, any history of sexual abuse, sexual assault, any history of child protective services or juvenile detention. Those kinds of issues. There can be relationship factors. Most kids who are running away from a dysfunctional family, and that gets them out on the street where they're vulnerable. And then there are certain factors that involve whole communities that render everybody in the community at risk. For example, people who live near military bases where there's a lot of transient male population coming in and out. Everyone around there is kind of at risk. People who live in very high tourist areas, a port town on the Ghana coast, for example, or in Las Vegas. There's a lot of people coming to party and have fun. That's a community risk factor as well. And then societal risk factors, things like cultural views about gender roles, bias and discrimination against females, sexual objectification. Those things all kind of condone exploitation, homophobia, transphobia. So you may be thinking to yourself, well, this is a horrible problem, but what does it have to do with us as healthcare providers? Actually, there are a number of studies now that show that a high proportion of people who are trafficked here in the United States see a healthcare provider at one point or another while they're being trafficked or soon after that. In one study in the Midwest, looking at the children's health system, about 82% of the identified victims of trafficking had been seen at their health center within the past year. And in our study, about 42% had been seen in the last 2 months before we identified them as being trafficked. So they are coming into our emergency departments, they're coming into our clinics, public health clinics, teen clinics, Planned Parenthood, many coming into the emergency department. So we really have to be prepared to identify victims because we are seeing them, we just don't realize it. So how do you think? Hector, remember Hector, doesn't speak English, he's from Guatemala, he's working in construction, he said he was working. How do you think he might show up in the emergency department? Why would he come? Injury. Preventable injury. Do you think he gets all that safety training and the protection? Nah. So preventable injury, other types of violence, injury from trauma, there's a lot of violence to keep people in line, to make them work faster. What's that? Fight. Yep. Malnutrition, dehydration, exposure. He's not living in an apartment. He's living in a very close quarters on the construction site, very bad, unhygienic circumstances. So he may have scabies and communicable diseases. He may have an exacerbation of a chronic illness, for example. Do you think he's going to come by himself? Or do you think he'll come with somebody else? Yeah, who would bring him? And who is that? The trafficker. Right. So they're not going to let Hector come and tell us what's going on. They're going to make sure that Hector doesn't say anything. So that person may be very sort of in your face, not real aggressive, but just sort of controlling, domineering of the situation. So you ask Hector a question, he answers. You ask Hector, he answers. He doesn't know anything about Hector's health, but he's going to answer anyway. He doesn't want a professional interpreter. He wants to translate himself. He doesn't want to leave Hector alone during the exam because God forbid Hector say something. Meanwhile, Hector's got his eyes down, not making any eye contact. He's intimidated. What about Pat or Keisha, both being sex trafficked? How might they present? STI testing is a big one, huge one. STI, HIV testing, pregnancy-related issues are very big. So any of those things, would they come alone with somebody?
Yeah, they might come alone.
Pat might come alone. They can come alone. They can come with a bunch of other kids, all asking for STI testing. They may have somebody who's an adult bringing in a few girls or boys, all wanting STI testing. We had somebody say, we had Planned Parenthood. We had this one guy kept bringing in 2 girls. He'd bring them in for, reproductive health, and then about 2 months later, he'd bring another 2 girls in. And it was the same guy showing up. So maybe like that. We don't know who that person is. The person who is with them may look like a 14-year-old friend. The friend could have been sent by the trafficker to make sure that your patient doesn't say anything. So we really don't know who that other person is. If you look at labor trafficking, so Hector, depending on the labor sector, it really depends on the kinds of issues you'll see, but untreated chronic conditions, acute trauma, and a lot of chronic pain and strain. Untreated injuries that cause disfigurement, cause functional impairments, exposure to chemicals and dust, toxins, so there might be a lot of respiratory issues or rashes, burns from chemical burns, etc. When you have sex trafficking and when labor trafficking also involves sexual exploitation, there's a lot of overlap there. You'll tend to see a lot of STIs. In our study of adolescent kids, most of whom were girls, about 47% of them had an active STI when they were identified as being trafficked. 33% of them said they had a history of an STI. So if you have a 14-year-old who says, I have vaginal discharge, and oh, by the way, I had chlamydia last year, we really have to ask ourselves what's going on there. Pregnancy, very common. 33% of our kids have a history of pregnancy. Many of them get abortions, which may or may not be done by somebody who's qualified, so they may come in with complications, bleeding, infection, sepsis, that kind of thing. Chronic pain again, lots of emotional problems. And so mental health issues are really big, and that may be an indicator for you. When people come in, they give histories of PTSD symptoms, depression, suicidality. In one study of adolescents, 50% of the kids reported having attempted suicide within the past year. These kids are really depressed, and a lot of high rates of PTSD. And so they may come in for something like that, a suicide attempt, for example, or because they're really acting out, somebody brings them in. So that might be what you see. But they're not going to come in and say, hey, I'm Hector and I'm here for labor trafficking. That's my chief complaint. Don't forget to write that one down. Sorry. They're not going to do that, right? So how are we going to recognize them? Well, why wouldn't Hector come in and say anything? Why wouldn't Keisha say anything?
If they're afraid of getting in trouble, Hector would get deported. And
Hector would get deported. He sees us. We're the same as the police. We're all the same. So we're going to deport him. Or he's going to get arrested because he's illegal, or Keisha's going to get arrested because she was prostituting, or maybe they made her deal some drugs to make sure she's committed a crime. Now she's scared. A great way a trafficker can control a child is to say you'll get arrested for drug use and drug selling. So they're afraid, they're ashamed of what has happened. Hector may be so ashamed if he's realized what's happened that he's been duped, and he thinks maybe you're going to laugh at him and think, what a stupid fool he was to go for that. So they may be ashamed, they may be afraid, they may feel very guilty about it, that somehow they contributed to all this. But I think one of the biggest things, especially with kids, is that they don't realize they're being trafficked. They have no idea, and you can't complain about something if you don't realize it's there. So Keisha could almost be certain that Keisha would identify one of those men as being her boyfriend. And she would say, I want to do what he wants me to do. Sure, he beats me up, but he loves me. I'm doing this for my man. I want to help out. It's my way of showing my love is to go out and turn tricks for him. And she believes it. So we couldn't say to her, you're a human trafficking victim. She would look at you like you had two heads. So I think not realizing, and Hector would really have no way of knowing whether he's being labor trafficked or not. He doesn't know what labor looks like in the United States. He looks around, everybody's getting beaten up. Everybody's working 14-hour days. So maybe he thinks that's just the way it is. Normalizes it. So it's up to us to think about what indicators may be suggestive of trafficking. None of the indicators I'm going to give you are pathognomonic at all. And these are very soft indicators. They don't have a big evidence base behind them, mostly anecdotal, and a few survivors talking about many times being brought in by a trafficker who is domineering. Doesn't want to be there, wants to pay in cash, wants to get in, out, not answer a lot of questions, and doesn't want to leave the person alone. So that's an anecdotal. Many survivors will talk about that. Meanwhile, the patient is very intimidated and submissive. In some cases, they'll give obviously false information. They're not going to say, well, I was beaten up by a John. They're going to say that, so they're getting knocked off the bus or whatever. So if it doesn't make sense, the injuries don't make sense, that might be your clue. Or you have obviously faulty demographic information. Somebody's saying they're 17 and then more likely look like 12. In some cases of labor and sex trafficking, especially when it's well controlled by fairly big groups of traffickers, they move victims from place to place to place. And so they may have arrived, Keisha may have been moved around. She may have arrived in Denver last night, has no idea where she is. She's put out, go get your quota. She gets beaten up by a buyer, so she ends up in your emergency department. She doesn't know where she is. She couldn't tell you where she's going to be staying. So she looks like a deer in headlights when you start asking those questions. These are more evidence-based indicators, and these are really the health effects that we see so very often that we've already talked about. So if you see somebody, especially an adolescent, come in with a reproductive issue and they give a history of a prior STI or prior pregnancy, be aware of that. If you see signs of physical abuse, it may look very much like child physical abuse. Loop marks, things like that, burns, can be related to trauma from buyers and from traffickers. Illicit drug use, very high levels of drug use. About 88% of our kids use drugs, mostly for, why do you think? Self-medicating. It's not so much that they're addicted and that's what draws them in. That happens to some people. But I think in more cases, they're using drugs like any other adolescent, but then when they're trafficked, they start upping the drugs and using more frequently to deal with the stress and to stay awake longer, to be able to perform. Sexual assault, we've had a couple of kids come in who have come in for acute sexual assault. It's only when you talk to them a little bit more that you realize it's not an isolated event. This is in the context of human trafficking. So that may be how you see them. If you have concerns about somebody, maybe Keisha or Hector, things are just not looking right, you notice some of these risk factors, there are a couple of things to keep in mind when interacting with them and dealing with them. One is that these kids and adults have been extremely traumatized, and that's going to really have a big impact on the way they interact with you. Have you all heard of trauma-informed care? Yeah, many of you have. Well, I think that that's the best way to go about dealing with any patient, but especially one who's been traumatized chronically, like a trafficked person. So these are some of the real tenets of trauma-informed care. One of them is it's very victim-centered or patient-centered. And you think, oh yeah, okay, we all do that. This becomes very important with trafficked persons because you think about getting all the people involved, the mandatory reporter thing, right? You got to call police. So the police, they have their agenda. They want to talk to the child. They want to ask all these questions they're interrogating so they can go out and do their investigation. And then you got to call Child Protective Services, and they have a whole other set of questions they want to ask the child. They want to get their interview done. And then I'm the healthcare provider. I want to do my STI testing. I want to do this and this. And everybody's got an agenda. So we have to say to ourselves, what does the child want? And what's best for them? And it may be that the child says, I don't want to do a sexual assault kit. I know I should, but I don't want to. You're not getting near me with those swabs. In which case, we got to respect that. So even though that's high on my list and my agenda, I got to put it down. So it's very, very much victim-centered. It also takes into consideration the impact of all that trauma. If you think about Keisha, now she's 14, she's been in the life for a year. Do you think she's the same person she was when she was 12? No way. What was she like when she was 12? She probably felt a lot of self-confidence. The whole world is her oyster. She's got great parents, she's got it in school, she's really good at what she does, and she can do anything she wants. The world is a safe place. People like her. People are going to take care of her. Now, what does she think about the world? It's a very dangerous place. Everybody wants to exploit her. They're after something for her. She's got to look out for herself. She can't trust anybody. So all of that is going to affect the way she interacts with you and the way she reads your facial expressions and interprets what you say. It's going to affect her behavior as well. So she may act in ways that are completely inappropriate for an emergency department, or when you're picking her up in an ambulance. She may be aggressive, she may be withdrawn, she may be laughing inappropriately, she may be very cocky and in control, kind of, a little bit arrogant. Things that just don't make a lot of sense. It's because of this trauma. And so if we can step back and say, this is the way she's got to deal with a very dangerous world. This is the way she's adapted. It's easier for us to be non-judgmental. So if she starts yelling at me, I don't want to talk to you. I don't want, you can't even, I'm not getting on that table. I'm not even getting that gown. Forget it. I'm leaving. Instead of getting defensive, I could say, I see why she thinks this way. What is she thinking? She's thinking she doesn't know what I'm going to do. She's angry at me. She's afraid what I'm going to do. She's out of control. So this is her way of dealing with it. Come out with both guns blazing is the best way to protect yourself. If I can understand that, then I can back up and say, okay, sounds like you've been through one hell of a night before you got here. Why don't you tell me about it? And so get her talking, get her so that you start working with her. It's a lot easier to do that if you understand why she's acting that way. Another thing is the whole sense of safety. And this is on two levels. Physical safety is incredibly important for you and for your colleagues. We have to be aware of the safety measures that you would take for, say, domestic violence or somebody violent in the emergency department. Know what that policy is. But it's also psychological safety. Do you think that Keisha or Pat or Hector feels comfortable when I'm talking to them? They feel safe. I know they're safe. They're safe in the hospital. That's great. No, they don't feel safe. They feel terribly vulnerable. So we have to take steps to make them feel safe. And one of those is to separate them from whomever they are with. Because again, we don't know who that person is and what their role is. So you need to separate them and have an easy, reliable way of doing that. How do you do that now?
Taking them to the bathroom, getting a urine sample.
Yep, you can take the patient away. Make up something. You got to do radiology. I know you have a vaginal discharge, but you need a chest X-ray. I've decided you need to go to radiology. One of the surefire ways to do it, though, is to say, it's our practice here at wherever you are to interview all of our patients alone. So I'm going to ask you to step out. You know where the waiting room was? It was just down the hall, right? And you open the door. You're not really asking. You're saying, this is what we do with everybody. 95% of the time, that's going to work. If it doesn't, then you can do something like removing the patient or saying, I need you, companion, to go fill out some paperwork. So you remove one or the other. When you get them alone, then you can sort of start to build rapport, make them feel comfortable. I think one of the really good ways to build trust and feel safe is to address their basic physical needs. Are you hungry? Are you warm enough? How many times have you been in the emergency department where it's cold? I don't think I've ever been in the emergency department where it's really warm. So do you need another blanket or something? When was the last time you ate? So that really shows that I care about you and starts to break down the barriers. Those kinds of things can be really helpful. And being very calm, non-judgmental. There are a couple of survivor studies that look at what survivors had their experiences with healthcare providers. Almost universally, they'll say, I felt like I was being judged. The minute they found out what was going on, their face changed, their expression changed, their words changed, the way they treated me changed, and I felt like they judged me. So we have to be really, really careful to be non-judgmental and very open. Respecting privacy and confidentiality, we don't want people going in and out, in and out, in and out of the room. So you might want to set, put a sign on the door, interview going, please don't come in, or say, so that people don't come in and out and they don't feel totally rattled. The other thing is getting out in front of the limits of confidentiality. Here in Colorado, in most states, you're mandated to report if you suspect sex trafficking a child or trafficking a child. So we know if you are starting to talk to Keisha and you're getting this bad feeling, you're thinking, okay, I may very well have to call the police on this. You don't want to ask her all these sensitive questions without telling her that you're going to have to share that information. So before you even get started on that, you say, Keisha, I'm not going to call your mother and tell her everything we talked about. But there are a couple of instances where I would have to share the information we're going to talk about, and this is, suicidality, homicidality, rattle out the time, the things that you have to break confidentiality for. So she can decide what she wants to talk to me about. Getting out in front of that helps build trust, shows a lot of respect, and you don't betray them at the end. The thing that took me a long time to learn, which I'm hoping won't take as long for everybody else, is that my goal and your goal is really not to get the person to disclose that they've been trafficked. Why? Because a lot of times they don't know they've been trafficked, so they can't disclose that. So that's not our goal. Our goal instead is to assess the risk. How much concern do I have that Keisha is being trafficked? What is my level of suspicion? Because if you rise to a level of suspicion that meets the mandatory reporter requirement, which is what, a reasonable level of concern, you need to make the report. How many times have we all made reports to Child Protective Services for suspected physical abuse? When you don't know at the time, for sure, whether it's physical abuse, you have a reasonable suspicion. That's the level that we're looking at. We don't have to know for sure. I don't have to badger Keisha until she finally says, oh, for God's sake, yes, he gave me $50 for that blowjob, okay? I don't need to do that. It's very traumatizing. So I can just ask questions to figure out, do I need to be worried about Keisha or not? If it rises to a certain level, then I make a report. So I need to assess risk and educate and offer resources. Those are the two biggest goals that healthcare providers have. Assess risk, offer resources. And so this is the 6-item screen that we've developed and validated for adolescents for sex trafficking. It does not do labor trafficking, so have to qualify that. If the child answers yes to 2 or more of these, then they're deemed high risk. And that would mean, okay, then the next step is taken, and that would mean following up on any of the positive questions. So for example, if somebody said, yes, I ran away from home, that's positive. I'd want to know more about that. Can you tell me about the last time you ran away? Open-ended questions. Because if they say, well, I ran away for 2 hours, I was pissed off with my mother, and then I went home, that's not high risk. But if she says I stayed out for a week, I was off running with kids I didn't even know for a week, that is really high risk. So you ask open-ended questions, and then you may, depending on the rapport and the feeling, you might go a little bit more direct and say, I see a lot of kids who are out on the street sometimes, and they don't have any money, and so they have to sometimes use sex as a way to get money, exchange that for food or for shelter, for money. Have you ever had to consider that or known anyone who has done that? I'm not saying, Keisha, did you do that? I'm saying, have you ever had to think about that? If Keisha says, yeah, I thought about it, but I didn't do it, that would still make me very concerned, because chances are she has done it or has been in a really high-risk situation. Sometimes you may suspect that the parent is being trafficked. That's another one, especially with young mothers in nurseries that is delivering. Mothers may be trafficked, and there is this tool, an 8-item tool that is for adults, and I can give you resources for that. Sometimes people will talk about, instead of screening so much, just giving universal education about healthy relationships and the impact of violence on somebody's lives, and harm reduction, safety, keeping yourself safe, which is another way to go about it. In my own opinion, I think this is good with the screening that's a little bit more, gets into a little bit more of the risk factors so that you can figure out where the risk is. But keep in mind, it's not so much what you ask, it's how you ask it. right? We don't want to ask it in a way, well, hey, Keisha, have you ever done this before? Have you gotten yourself in this mess before? How's that for blaming? We don't want to ask it in that way. We're almost done. Now you've got to the point where you decide, okay, this is, oh God, it falls on me, I'm going to have to make a report. Oh, I knew it was my bad day. Okay, what do you have to do? Well, we have to know our mandated reporter laws. We know for kids. I don't know what the laws for mandatory reporting are for adults in Colorado, but keep that in mind. Many states have these laws about violence, certain types of violence for mandatory reporters, so know that. And respect the privacy and the confidentiality. So any non-mandated referral, we have to get their consent. So I can't just say, you know, I know a runaway shelter for you, Keisha, and you can go to that. Why don't I call? I'll just call. Okay, I'll just call. You need her consent. And for adults, if it's not a mandatory report, even if you know that Hector is, now he's 18, is being labor trafficked, if he says, I don't want you to call police, we don't. We have to respect that. One of the things that we really want to do is get people involved in their own safety plan, their own engagement. It's really important and very respectful to say, what do you think should happen now? Keisha, we've talked about a number of things that, you've got a lot of sex partners, you're not living at home, you're living with your 25-year-old boyfriend, and you mentioned that you're using drugs a fair amount. So there's a lot of things going on in your life. What do you think would be most helpful for you? I've got some ideas, but what do you think? And then you ask, and then you say, what do you think about this idea of Covenant House or whatever? And they may say, oh, I've heard of Covenant House. That's a lousy place to go. Shoot, I didn't know that. But the word on the street is important to know. So getting them involved is really, really, really important. For Colorado, this is your response, calling local law enforcement in the jurisdiction where the trafficking occurred, where the crime occurred, if you know. And social work will do that. Innocence Lost is FBI, is another alternative. And then the child protection team at Children's can be very, very helpful as well. Wherever you go, wherever you are around the country, if you forget everything about this talk, if you can just take a picture of that, slide, this is going to be a help wherever you are. They have a 24-hour hotline, and you can call them up and say, this weird lady came and gave us a talk about human trafficking. I don't remember what she said. She talked too fast, but she told me to call this number. And I have somebody, and I'm worried about trafficking. I don't remember what I'm supposed to do. What questions should I ask? And they can help you. They can also talk to patients if the patient gives consent. Obviously, we can't give any private protected health information, but they are very good, have interpreters for many, many different languages. So we're just about done, but what's next after all this? If you're interested at all, the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children just completed this toolkit for human trafficking, and it's designed for healthcare providers and healthcare administrators to evaluate their own services, their own hospitals, their own clinics, to see what kind of healthcare services are available for trafficked persons. You do a self-assessment and you say, this is what happens in my facility. You go through the whole self-assessment, you figure out where the weaknesses are, and then you go back to the toolkit where there are recommendations and resources to say, if you're short on training, here's some areas where you can get training. If you're short on safety issues, think about this. So it's a toolkit if you are interested in looking kind of at your own service and improving it. So just to conclude, we are probably already seeing trafficked persons. They're going to come in any different form, in any different way. There's no profile, but they have immense needs. If we can maintain that sort of non-judgmental, trauma-informed approach, I think that's going to be our best approach. This is my contact information. This is the Institute on Healthcare and Human Trafficking, where you can get the screens that I put up here, the adolescent screen, the adult screen, are available, as well as a lot of other resources, research and templates.